A wedding meant to honor love collapses in an instant when a pregnant bride is slapped by her own mother-in-law in front of a stunned crowd, cameras capturing everything while her husband turns away in cold silence. That act of public cruelty becomes the spark, because in the very moment of humiliation, she makes a quiet decision that will strip power, expose buried abuse, and force a reckoning no one at that wedding could have imagined. What follows is a collision of control, image, and truth. And trust me, you will not see the ending until we step fully into the heart of this story. Let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from. Leave a comment below. The estate in Virginia felt too polished to be real. All vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers that threw clean white reflections across the aisle runner. The light didn't warm anything. It sharpened edges, turned smiles into masks, and made every movement look like it belonged on a stage. Grace Miller stood at the entrance of the aisle in an ivory maternity wedding gown that skimmed over her 7-month belly and fell to the floor in a soft, steady line. Lace sleeves hugged her arms like a fragile promise. Her brown hair was pinned low at her neck. Not perfect, just controlled enough to hold together. She drew in a careful breath, the kind you take when you're trying to keep your heart from showing on your face. And she stepped forward with her spine straight, even as her lungs fluttered. Ethan Miller was beside her in a navy suit with a white shirt and charcoal gray tie. Polished shoes planted like anchors. He looked sharp, successful, untouchable, until you noticed his eyes. They didn't meet hers. They didn't meet anyone's. His gaze slid past the guests as if he were searching for an exit he couldn't admit he needed, swallowing something that tasted like fear. In the first row sat Margaret Miller in a champagne evening gown, a thin wrap draped over her shoulders, pearls pressed bright against her throat. Her silver blonde hair was set in precise waves, her metallic clutch resting on her knee like a verdict. She didn't look proud. She looked cold, like she had arrived already certain of how this would end. The pianist softened into a lower, slower chord, and whispers rose from the older guests, low, private, steady, drifting through the room like air slipping under a door. Grace felt them brush her skin. She could almost hear what they meant without catching every word. The belly, the timing, the family name, the question of whether she belonged. The officiant lifted his hands to begin the welcome, but Margaret raised one palm with the smallest, most commanding gesture. The words stopped in the officiant's mouth. Even the pianist hesitated, as if the keys had turned to ice under his fingers. Margaret stood, slowly, deliberately. A thin smile touched her lips, sharp at the corners, and her gaze moved down the aisle and settled not on Grace's face, but on the curve of her belly, as if that was the only part worth addressing. She took a step into the aisle runner's light, claiming it as her own. Her voice carried without strain. She said the child had come at the wrong time. She said the family had been embarrassed in front of the community. The words were neat, practiced, designed to sting without sounding messy. Grace felt her cheeks heat, not from shame, but from the instinct to protect what was growing inside her from anything cruel. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse. She didn't create a scene. When she spoke, it was clear and steady, a line drawn with calm conviction. She said her baby deserved respect. She said a mother's dignity wasn't a favor anyone could grant or take away. Ethan's throat tightened visibly. His jaw flexed. He heard every word, and for a second, Grace thought he might finally step between them. But he stayed where he was, shoulders stiff, hands by his sides, letting the space between wife and mother remain empty. Margaret moved closer, her perfume thick and sweet, too much for such clean air. Grace's body reacted before her mind did, the sensation of being cornered without walls. Margaret called her a gold digger, the phrase tossed out with the confidence of someone who believed money could rewrite character. She implied Grace had married for the Miller name, for the Miller wealth, for whatever Margaret thought was hers to guard. A few guests blinked hard, startled by the bluntness. Others sat perfectly still, faces trained into polite neutrality, the familiar posture of people who had learned to mind their own business in public. The silence wasn't innocent, it was habit. Grace placed her hand lightly against the lace over her belly, not as a performance, but as a quiet check-in. She felt the small, living pressure inside her and held herself steady for that sake. Her eyes stayed on Margaret, but her attention split, part of her listening inward, reminding her child, "We are still standing." Margaret's arm rose, swift and certain. The motion had the crispness of rehearsal. For a heartbeat, Grace didn't believe she would do it. Not here, not in front of everyone, not under chandeliers that were meant to celebrate. Then, the hand came down. The slap cracked through the room, dry and cold, dividing the air like a snapped branch. Grace's head turned slightly with the force. Her cheek burned instantly, but her feet stayed planted on the white runner. She did not stumble. She did not fall. She simply stood there with the impact visible on her skin and the shock visible in the room. A sharp inhale burst from somewhere in the seats, then everything dropped into an unnatural quiet. Even the officiant's hands lowered, unsure of where to put them. The pianist's fingers hovered, then pressed the next note as if on instinct. Ethan's eyes landed on the reddening mark on Grace's face. His fingers curled into a fist at his side. He tightened his grip on nothing. He did not step forward. Grace turned her gaze to him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't pleading. It was a question held in one look. "Are you going to save me? Are you going to save our child from this?" And it carried a pain so direct, it almost made the air heavier. Ethan shifted backward half a step, a reflex as honest as it was devastating, the movement of a man who feared his mother more than he feared losing his wife. Grace watched it happen with a stillness that felt like glass settling into place. Margaret scanned the room as if she had won something. Her posture remained tall, her expression satisfied, confident that the power she carried would keep everyone in line. Grace swallowed hard, forcing her tears to stay behind her eyes, refusing to give Margaret the spectacle of her breaking. The officiant stammered, visibly rattled, but Margaret gave him a sharp, immediate order to continue, as though nothing had happened. The ceremony's words were dragged forward over the wreckage, the way some families drag tradition over bruises to keep appearances intact. Grace felt the steady thump inside her belly like a small knocking, a quiet insistence that she stay alive, that she stay upright. In the crowd, an older woman lifted a hand to her chest, eyes wet, not in gossip, but in genuine horror at what she had witnessed. Margaret sat back down as if returning to tea, dropping a final line about women knowing their place. The pearls at her throat caught the light, bright and merciless. Grace stayed still for one more beat, letting the room's silence press against her skin, letting the shock settle so she could move without shaking. Ethan stared down at the floor, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. And Grace felt that refusal sliced deeper than the slap. His silence became a second blow, quieter but sharper. Then she turned, slowly. She stepped away from the aisle runner and began to walk out, the hem of her ivory gown whispering against the polished floor. Behind her, the music continued, soft, dutiful, indifferent, filling the space she left with a sound that felt less like celebration and more like a cold, steady mockery. Grace moved down the long hallway alone, her steps measured, her back straight, refusing to let her pace reveal anything she was feeling. The warm yellow lights lining the corridor only made the red mark on her cheek stand out more clearly, a quiet but undeniable record of what had just happened. Each light she passed felt like another witness that chose to stay silent. The ivory maternity gown brushed softly against the stone floor, the fabric whispering with every step. A faint dragging sound that reminded her of a long exhale she hadn't been able to release. The dress was still beautiful. That fact hurt more than she expected, because beauty had done nothing to protect her. She stopped by a tall window overlooking the lawn. Outside, the grass stretched wide and manicured, dark green under the evening sky. A cold wind cut across the estate grounds, around 45 degrees Fahrenheit, seeping through the glass and chilling her fingers. Her hands tightened slightly, not from the cold alone, but from the effort of keeping herself steady. Behind her, inside the hall, the wedding continued. Chairs shifted. Voices murmured. The ceremony moved forward, as if nothing had broken. That continuation pressed down on her chest harder than any shout could have. The world had decided that what happened to her was inconvenient, not unacceptable. Footsteps approached. Grace didn't turn right away. She already knew who it was. Ethan came into view beside her reflection in the glass. His navy suit was still immaculate, the tie perfectly aligned, the image of composure intact. Only his eyes betrayed him. They looked scattered, uncertain, as if something inside him had cracked and he didn't know how to gather the pieces. He spoke quietly, telling her his mother had only lost her temper. He said it the way someone minimizes a spill on the floor, as if a quick apology could erase the mess. To him, the slap was an emotional outburst. To Grace, it was a public declaration of her worth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She knew exactly how quickly a woman's pain could be dismissed once it became loud. Instead, she asked him a single, calm question. She asked why he hadn't protected his wife and his child in front of everyone. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared past her shoulder, jaw tight, then admitted he hadn't wanted the wedding to turn into a scandal. The words settled between them, heavy and revealing. In that moment, Grace understood something with sharp clarity. His fear of embarrassment outweighed his instinct to defend her. That realization hollowed her out. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, like the sudden absence of sound after a door closes. She looked directly at him and saw not cruelty, but habit. A man practiced in lowering his head, practiced in avoiding conflict, practiced in letting stronger personalities decide what was acceptable. He didn't look like someone ready to stand in front of harm. He looked like someone trained to step aside. A server passed by them, carrying a tray of glasses. The woman's eyes flicked toward Grace's cheek, and then away just as quickly, her head dipping in avoidance. Even strangers knew this was something they weren't supposed to acknowledge. Grace took a tissue from the nearby table and gently dabbed at her mouth where lipstick had smeared from the impact. The cosmetic stain faded. The red imprint on her skin did not. She studied it in the reflection, not with self-pity, but with attention, as if committing evidence to memory. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited but persistent, to the practical realities waiting for her. Prenatal appointments, medical bills, insurance forms, the quiet nights when she woke, already worrying about a child who wasn't even born yet. None of those responsibilities had paused for this wedding. None of them would disappear. Ethan mentioned the cost of the event, reminding her that his family had paid for everything. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and the damage was immediate. Grace heard calculation where there should have been remorse. She heard leverage where there should have been care. She answered him evenly, telling him that money did not buy the right to humiliate a pregnant woman. Her tone never rose. That restraint made her words heavier, not lighter. Laughter floated faintly from the reception hall. Someone enjoying a moment meant to be joyful. The sound reached her through layers of walls and distance, and it made her feel colder than the wind outside. Celebration, she realized, was selective. Ethan suggested she return inside and smile, just for a little while. He said older guests didn't like tension. He framed it as advice, as if he were helping her manage the situation. Grace heard it for what it was, a request to disappear emotionally so others could remain comfortable. She absorbed that sentence slowly, recognizing it as a judgment. Her feelings, her pain, her dignity were being labeled as problems to be managed rather than truths to be faced. Grace rested her hand against her belly, a small, Gentle movement answered her touch, a reminder that she was not standing there alone. The sensation grounded her. Whatever else happened, she could not afford to collapse. Not here, not now. Ethan took a step closer. His body moved forward, but his hands stayed at his sides. He didn't reach out. He didn't place a reassuring palm on her shoulder. The distance between them remained, invisible, but exact. She asked him one final question, her voice low but steady. She asked that if he could leave her unprotected today, what would stop him from doing the same to their child tomorrow? He swallowed hard, his mouth opened, then closed again. No promise came, no certainty followed. His silence stretched long enough to feel permanent. That hesitation told her everything she needed to know. The future he offered was undefined, unmarked, a road without signs or guarantees. She could already see how often she would be asked to endure quietly. Grace turned away from him and walked toward the dressing room. The mirror inside reflected a woman with tired eyes and a bruised cheek, but also a woman still standing. She studied her reflection and recognized a pattern she had ignored for too long. Endurance had slowly become expectation, and expectation had become risk. An older woman from the guest list approached hesitantly and pressed a small bottle of water into Grace's hand. The gesture was gentle, sincere, and brief. Grace thanked her, accepting the kindness without confusing it for accountability. Compassion from strangers could not replace responsibility from a spouse. Alone again, Grace reached for her phone. She scrolled through old emails and stored documents, files she had once considered unimportant, details she had trusted others to handle. Her thumb paused, then moved on, absorbing information with new focus. She lowered the phone and let the quiet settle around her. The hallway hummed softly, filled with distant music and unspoken judgments. In that stillness, Grace made a clear decision. Ethan's silence would not be forgotten. It would not be excused. It would be remembered, preserved, and used as proof of the choice he had already made. The music continued behind the walls. Grace stood perfectly still, listening, until the sound no longer felt sharp but distant, like something belonging to another life. Grace lowered herself onto the upholstered chair inside the dressing room and closed her eyes for a brief moment, focusing on slowing her breathing so it stayed even and controlled. Each inhale felt deliberate, chosen for the sake of the baby she carried, not for the storm still echoing outside the door. The room was quiet, insulated from the ceremony's noise, yet the silence pressed harder than sound. Her thoughts drifted backward to the day she had signed the papers for the house. She remembered the realtor's office, the polished desk, the neat stacks of documents. Ethan had smiled then, relaxed and confident, telling her it was just paperwork, and that it would be easier if he signed on her behalf. She had nodded, trusting him, believing that this was how marriage worked when one partner handled details the other didn't enjoy. That memory didn't stand alone. It connected to several others, small moments that had seemed harmless at the time. There had been contracts she hadn't read closely, emails she had skimmed, meetings she had skipped because Ethan said he would take care of them. She had told herself it was efficiency, not exclusion. Sitting there now, she felt how easily that belief had formed. Grace opened her email and searched through old messages, her fingers steady despite the tension in her shoulders. Buried among routine correspondence, she found a PDF she hadn't opened in years. The document detailed the purchase of the suburban property, valued at more than $2 million, complete with dates, signatures, and legal language she had once found overwhelming. Her eyes moved to the ownership section, and she froze. The primary name listed was hers, not Ethan's, not the Miller Family Trust. Hers. She read the line again, slower this time, making sure she wasn't misunderstanding it. The realization didn't arrive as shock. It arrived as a sharp, clarifying stillness. She remembered the corporate attorney explaining that the arrangement would protect the family. At the time, she had assumed that meant the Millers, not herself. No one had explained further, and she hadn't asked. She had trusted the process because she trusted the people in it. Grace continued searching. More files appeared. Investment accounts, financial summaries, trust-related documents. She discovered several funds connected to credit accounts under her name, structured in a way that legally favored her interests. Ethan's signature appeared repeatedly, authorizing transactions, but the legal benefits pointed toward her. A new understanding formed slowly. Margaret had always spoken with certainty about control, about knowing exactly how everything was arranged. Yet the documents told a different story. The real power wasn't where Margaret believed it was. It had been quietly placed elsewhere. Grace felt two emotions rise at once. Fear tightened her chest, but clarity sharpened her thoughts. She wasn't suddenly powerful. She was suddenly aware. Her mind returned to the slap, to the sound it made, to the deliberate nature of the gesture. She thought of protecting her child not with endurance, but with structure, boundaries, and law. Tears would not change what had happened. Knowledge might. A knock sounded at the door. Grace didn't answer immediately. She needed one more moment to steady herself, to make sure her voice wouldn't tremble. Ethan entered cautiously, his posture stiff. He asked whether she intended to make things worse, the question carrying more concern for consequence than for harm. Grace looked at him calmly and told him the worst thing had already happened, when she was struck in front of everyone and he had done nothing. Ethan defended his mother, saying she would never apologize publicly because she believed that would diminish her authority. Grace listened and understood something critical. Margaret's behavior would not stop. There were no internal limits guiding it. Without resistance, it would continue. Grace asked Ethan directly whether he was willing to step away from his mother's control, to choose his wife and child over his position within the family structure. The question hung between them, clear and unavoidable. Ethan didn't answer directly. He spoke instead about responsibility, about expectations, about his role at the company. The avoidance revealed more than any confession could have. His fear of losing status outweighed his willingness to protect his family. In that moment, Grace saw the marriage without illusion. It wasn't sustained by partnership. It was managed through hierarchy. She reminded him quietly that she had her own career, her own income, and that she had contributed real money toward the home they lived in. Ethan tried to dismiss this, but the figures in the documents she held stripped his denial of strength. Grace noticed a line in one of the files she hadn't seen before. It referenced a protective transfer, tied specifically to pregnancy and inheritance. The phrase stood out, precise and intentional. It felt like a key placed where no one expected her to look. That line changed how she understood Margaret's confidence. The control Margaret believed she held was incomplete, built on assumption rather than verification. The realization didn't make Grace feel triumphant. It made her feel resolved. She decided then that she would not seek explanations from family lawyers whose loyalty was divided. She needed independent counsel. Someone without emotional ties or hidden obligations. A name came to her clearly: Jonathan Reed. She remembered his reputation, his calm precision, and the way he had helped a friend secure her assets during a difficult divorce. He had been thorough, ethical, and unafraid of powerful families. Grace sent him a short message, asking for an urgent meeting within 24 hours. The reply came quickly. He agreed and suggested his office, located about 18 miles from the estate. Grace lowered her phone and looked toward the window. The sky had darkened, the last light fading into gray. Inside her, however, something had shifted. The confusion that had defined the day was giving way to focus. She understood now that what came next was not about revenge. It was about reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from her in public. The room remained quiet, as that understanding settled fully, firm and unshakable. The next morning, Grace changed out of the ivory maternity wedding gown and into a modest navy maternity dress that fell smoothly over her belly without drawing attention. She pulled on a cream wool coat for warmth, buttoning it carefully as if each button were a small act of control returning to her hands. The mirror showed a faint, fading redness on her cheek, but her expression had shifted from stunned to focused, the way a person looks when they decide they will not be handled anymore. She walked out of the estate with steady steps. Her chest still ached in a quiet, persistent way, yet her grip on her car keys was firm. When she slid into the driver's seat, she adjusted the mirror, rested both hands on the steering wheel, and paused just long enough to make sure her breathing stayed even. She was not leaving in panic. She was leaving with intention. The driveway curved past trimmed hedges and stonework that had always been presented to her as family legacy. Grace guided the car toward the road, the tires humming softly as the estate disappeared behind a line of trees. The suburban route stretched about 20 miles, and she felt every mile as a kind of distance being created, between herself and the room where she had been humiliated, between herself and the idea that she should accept it. Traffic was light, the sky was pale, and the air had the crisp bite of late-season cold. Grace kept her eyes forward, letting the rhythm of the road match the rhythm of her thoughts. She did not replay the ceremony to torture herself. She replayed it the way a careful person reviews a warning sign they will never ignore again. Jonathan Reed's office sat in a clean, quiet building that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the scent of ordinary work and real consequences. Inside, the receptionist spoke softly and guided Grace to a waiting area where the lighting was neutral and the chairs were practical, not decorative. Everything about the place felt grounded. It didn't demand admiration, it demanded attention. Jonathan greeted her wearing a charcoal gray suit, the kind that looked professional without trying to impress. His voice was calm, his eyes direct, and there was no judgment in his expression. Grace noticed that immediately, because she had spent too long in rooms where people hid their opinions behind polite smiles. When they sat down, Grace told him exactly what had happened. She described the slap in the wedding aisle, the shock that rolled through the crowd, and the way the ceremony continued as though her pain were an inconvenience. She spoke about Ethan's silence, how he saw the mark on her face, and still chose not to move. She described the feeling of being turned into decoration, something placed beside a man to make him look complete, while she was treated as expendable. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He listened with the kind of patience that made space for the truth to land fully. Grace could tell he understood something about American family dynamics, especially among older generations, where respect is supposed to be the foundation of a home. The insult had not been private, it had been public, and that mattered. Grace laid her documents on the desk. Jonathan read each page slowly, carefully, as if he were holding something fragile and important. The quiet scratch of paper shifting under his fingers filled the pauses. Grace watched his eyes scan legal language, numbers, signatures, details that now felt like the only solid ground she could stand on. When Jonathan looked up, he told her plainly that several assets were in her name and that she had lawful rights to control them. He did not dramatize it. He did not soften it. He stated it the way a professional states fact. And the simplicity of that truth steadied Grace more than comfort ever could. He explained that her pregnancy could add protective considerations in many court decisions, not as a weapon, but as recognition that her health and safety carried greater urgency now. Grace listened closely. She wasn't looking for loopholes. She was looking for a path that would hold. Grace asked the question she had been carrying since the ceremony ended. Could the Miller family retaliate? She didn't mean only money. She meant reputation, pressure, whispers, the social weight that powerful families use to crush someone quietly. Jonathan answered honestly. Social power could create pressure, he said, But the law was not a game built on emotion. He told her that feelings might control rooms, but they did not control statutes. Grace felt her shoulders ease by a fraction, not because she suddenly believed everything would be easy, but because she finally heard someone speak in terms Margaret couldn't bend. Jonathan suggested a three-layer plan. First, personal safety, including boundaries and precautions that reduced risk. Second, asset protection, ensuring her legal control was documented and secure. Third, evidence protection, because in conflicts like this, truth often survives only when it is preserved properly. The word evidence struck Grace with quiet force. She immediately thought of Ethan's silence after the slap, the way his inaction had spoken louder than any insult. She didn't say it dramatically, she simply nodded, and Jonathan saw the recognition pass across her face. He asked whether there was video footage or credible witnesses. Grace told him the wedding aisle had a camera system from the event organizers and that many guests had clearly seen what happened. The truth hadn't occurred in a shadowed corner. It had happened under chandeliers and in front of people who would remember it. Jonathan warned her against confronting Margaret head-on right away. He explained that Margaret could easily frame the situation as family conflict, reducing violence into a messy personal disagreement and making Grace appear unstable. Grace understood the trap. She had already felt it when Ethan suggested she return and smile so older guests wouldn't feel uncomfortable. Jonathan advised her to prepare for a civil protective order if there were signs of continued threats or escalation. Grace nodded, wanting the story to remain what it was, a woman rescuing herself with calm discipline, not reckless impulse. She wasn't trying to win applause, she was trying to secure safety. He then guided her through practical steps. Store documents on a separate drive. Keep duplicates. Send copies to a safe location. Keep a clear record trail. Grace absorbed each instruction like a checklist for survival. When Jonathan slid an authorization form toward her, she signed it with a steady, legible hand. The act felt like a quiet declaration. She was no longer waiting for permission to be protected. Jonathan reminded her to care for her health, because prolonged stress could affect a pregnancy. Grace inhaled slowly, placed a hand on her belly, and felt the steady reminder of life there. That was the center of everything now. Not Margaret's pride, not Ethan's fear, not the estate's reputation. Jonathan emphasized that the next steps required calm. Margaret, he said, would not like losing control. And people who thrive on control often provoke chaos to regain advantage. Grace answered evenly that she had already endured humiliation in a crowded room, which meant she understood something important. Control itself was a weapon. Before she left, Jonathan arranged an appointment with a financial advisor to review suspicious transfers, keeping the focus on facts rather than rumor. Grace stood, thanked him, and walked out into air that felt around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold touched her face, but her chest felt warmer than it had in days because she could finally see a way forward. Her phone rang as she reached her car. Ethan's name lit the screen. His voice sounded tight when she answered, strained in a way that suggested fear of being discovered rather than concern for her well-being. Grace didn't argue. She told him she needed time, her words short and controlled, then ended the call before it could pull her back into the familiar loop of excuses. She drove back toward the estate with both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, her thoughts quiet and sharp. Nothing about the road had changed, but everything about her had. As the miles passed beneath the tires, Grace understood one thing with calm certainty. The plan to step out of Margaret's control had already begun to move, and the silence around her felt heavy, deliberate, and final. Grace returned to the estate wearing the calmest version of herself she could assemble. Her posture was steady, her voice soft, her face composed in a way that did not invite questions. She understood Margaret's instincts now. Any sign of defiance, would trigger the older woman's suspicion like an alarm. So Grace made herself look ordinary, almost familiar, as if the wedding slap had been nothing more than a misunderstanding that time had already smoothed over. She chose a light beige maternity dress and flat shoes, the kind of outfit that suggested comfort and modesty instead of confrontation. The fabric fell simply over her belly, and the color made her seem gentle, almost apologetic. She knew exactly how it would read to the people in that house. Not a threat, not a challenge, just Grace, coming back into her assigned place. From the living room, Margaret watched her arrive. The older woman sat in a champagne-colored dress that looked expensive without trying too hard. Her jewelry subtle but unmistakable. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes moved the way a hawk's eyes move, searching for the slightest tremor, the slightest shift that meant resistance was forming. Grace felt the scrutiny land on her and did not flinch. "I'm sorry," Grace said, keeping the apology short, not emotional, not pleading. It wasn't a confession, it was a tactic, a way to take control of the pace. The sentence was small, but it changed the rhythm of the room. Margaret heard surrender. Grace felt strategy. Ethan visibly relaxed. It showed in his shoulders, in the way his breathing loosened, in the quick relief that passed across his face. He wanted peace the way some people want air, not because it was right, but because it was easier for him to live inside. Grace watched him and understood, again, that comfort mattered to him more than courage. Margaret accepted the apology like a trophy, her mouth curved with satisfaction, and she immediately began issuing instructions, framing them as proper roles and how things are done in this family. She told Grace what to do, how to behave, where to stand, the same quiet dominance wrapped in manners. Grace nodded, compliant on the surface, while her mind stayed separate, alert, collecting details. When Margaret announced a family dinner, Grace agreed without hesitation. She needed time, she needed access, she needed space to gather what she could without raising suspicion. The dinner would create noise, distraction, movement in the house. That was useful. At the table, Margaret spoke as if she were delivering a lesson. She praised the Miller name, the Miller history, the Miller generosity, implying that everything Grace had was a gift handed down from their hands. The tone was polished, even warm to the guests who might be listening, but beneath it was a reminder. You exist here because we allow it. Grace listened without interrupting. She stored each sentence, each self-congratulating claim, because arrogance had a way of exposing weaknesses. People who believe they are untouchable stop checking their own locks. Ethan tried to contribute, talking about the company in a casual way, but he let something slip, mentioning large transfers he didn't fully understand. It was said lightly, like an annoyance, like paperwork he didn't have time to read. Grace asked a gentle follow-up question, her voice careful, her face neutral. Ethan answered with vague confidence that didn't match the numbers. His response confirmed what she suspected. He had never truly checked the finances. He had trusted the system the way he trusted his mother, by obeying it. That night, when the house quieted, Grace moved to the office. She opened the laptop with deliberate calm, the glow of the screen reflecting on her hands as she navigated folders and files. She copied data tied to property and assets, working steadily, not rushing, not panicking. This wasn't a theft. This was documentation. She wanted the facts preserved cleanly, the way they were, without edits or erasures that could be used against her later. She did not delete traces. She did not wipe history. She left the digital footprint intact because her goal wasn't to hide. Her goal was to be able to stand in a courtroom and let the truth speak without contamination. When the copying finished, she sent a duplicate to Jonathan Reed through a secure channel, then placed the external drive into her personal bag, tucked deep where it would not be found casually. Before she could fully exhale, Margaret called her down to the living room again. The summons was framed as household order. There was family business, and everyone would sit where they were told. It wasn't just seating, it was control rehearsed as tradition. Grace walked down with a calm face and nodded once, her obedience offered like a decoy. Inside, her focus stayed on something else entirely, protecting her baby with law, not with hope. Ethan asked if she had a prenatal appointment coming up. The question sounded procedural, like checking a box, not like concern. Grace answered that she did, and she said it plainly because she understood the value of medical records. Documentation mattered, timelines mattered, proof mattered. She would not be caught unprepared. Margaret scoffed, saying pregnant women were always overreacting. The comment was sharp enough to cut, delivered as if it were humor. Grace noticed how a couple of staff members lowered their eyes instinctively, as if they had learned that silence was safety. Grace didn't argue. She didn't correct. She watched. She listened. She let the ceiling lights above them burn into her memory, the room's angles, the positions people took when they felt powerful. Her phone vibrated with a message from Jonathan. Grace read it once, then again, keeping her expression still. He had found a clause that allowed her to decide where she lived without needing Ethan's consent. The words were precise, legal, real. Grace felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a sudden sense of exit. The house was not a permanent cage. It only felt that way because she had been trained to believe it was. She looked up from the phone and understood that the estate's grandeur was just architecture. Control was the true structure, and structures could be dismantled. Grace set an appointment with a financial advisor for the next day, about 12 miles away. The distance was small, but the step felt enormous. She wasn't moving recklessly. She was building a path with measurable, defensible choices. Margaret, meanwhile, began planning a family meeting with older guests, the kind of gathering meant to shame someone into submission under the guise of guidance. She spoke about teaching Grace a lesson, about correcting attitude, about restoring respect. Grace agreed to attend without hesitation. A crowd was exactly where Margaret was most likely to reveal herself. The more witnesses, the more predictable Margaret became. Ethan forced a laugh and told Grace she should just try to endure, as if endurance were the only virtue a woman needed. Grace turned her eyes to him and saw the truth with painful clarity. He wasn't asking for her strength. He was asking for her sacrifice so he could stay comfortable. Later, upstairs, Grace closed the bedroom door and finally let herself cry. The tears came hard and long, but she made no sound. She had learned silence in that house the way you learn weather, by survival. When the crying slowed, she felt a gentle movement from her baby. A small kick that grounded her back into purpose. She wiped her face, looked into the mirror, and held her own gaze. In that reflection, she made the decision without drama and without doubt. That slap in the wedding aisle was not the end of her dignity. It was the beginning of Margaret's collapse. Margaret hosted the family meeting in the estate's living room as if she were staging a civic event, not confronting the damage she had done. The furniture had been arranged to feel formal and intentional. Chairs angled toward the center, coffee table cleared, fresh flowers positioned like decoration for authority. She had invited several older friends from the community, people with polite reputations and heavy opinions, the kind who could turn whispered judgment into a social sentence. Grace entered wearing a conservative navy maternity dress, her hair gathered into a low bun that made her look composed and unshakable. The outfit wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to signal that she was not a careless girl being scolded. She looked like a woman who understood what respect should mean and was finally ready to require it. Ethan sat near her in his navy suit, posture stiff, hands too still on his knees. His expression carried the look of someone waiting to be called on in class, someone who hoped to escape attention but knew the spotlight was coming anyway. He did not reach for Grace. He did not offer comfort. He simply stayed close enough to appear involved. Margaret began with a speech about values. She spoke of morality and tradition, of loyalty and obedience, framing herself as the guardian of what was right. Her tone was practiced, measured, the kind of voice that made cruelty sound like guidance. She insisted that a daughter-in-law should understand her place, that a family only survived when the younger generation learned to submit to the older one. One of the older women, gray-haired, well-dressed, carrying the gentle authority of someone used to being listened to, looked at Grace with concern and asked quietly if she was all right. The woman said she had heard about an incident at the wedding. Her question wasn't rude. It sounded like genuine worry, a human response beneath layers of social etiquette. Margaret's mouth tightened into a thin smile. She gave a small laugh, dismissive and controlled, and said it had been nothing more than a slap to teach manners. She used the phrase as if it were harmless, as if it were an old-fashioned correction that everyone should understand. The room shifted. Several guests exchanged quick glances, a few brows furrowed. Even among older Americans who respected family structure, there were lines. Striking a pregnant woman did not sit comfortably inside anyone's idea of decency. The air cooled in a way that couldn't be blamed on the season outside. Grace spoke calmly. She did not attack. She did not insult. She said she respected the family, but she would not accept being physically assaulted. Her voice carried steady restraint, the kind that made people listen harder because it didn't beg for attention. She stated a boundary with clarity instead of emotion. Margaret's expression hardened. She shifted her tone instantly, labeling Grace ungrateful, twisting the conversation into a sermon about all the Millers had provided. She made it about loyalty. She made it about reputation. She tried to place Grace on trial for daring to object, turning the problem into Grace's attitude instead of Margaret's violence. The front door opened, and footsteps entered with purpose. Jonathan Reed appeared at exactly the moment the room began to tighten around Grace. He wore a charcoal suit and carried a brown leather briefcase in one hand. He didn't look theatrical. He looked prepared. His presence didn't raise his voice, but it raised the stakes. Margaret's eyes snapped toward him. "Who is that?" she demanded, and for the first time that afternoon, caution slipped into her tone. It wasn't fear. It was awareness that the room had shifted beyond her private control. Grace introduced Jonathan evenly as her attorney. The words landed like a cold bell. The living room did not erupt. It simply went still. The guests looked from Grace to Jonathan and then to Margaret, as if the entire scene had turned from a lecture into something more serious. Ethan started to rise, half standing as if his body didn't know whether to defend his mother or stop what was happening. Then he sank back into his chair, motionless, like a machine that had lost power. His uncertainty was visible, and it made him smaller. Jonathan spoke in a calm, professional tone. He said he was there to ensure the conversation stayed within lawful limits. The phrase, lawful limits, changed the mood immediately. Margaret's authority relied on social power, on intimidation, on family expectations. Law did not respond to those tools. Margaret's anger flared. She accused Grace of humiliating the family by bringing an outsider into their home. Her voice sharpened, trying to reclaim dominance. Grace answered, without raising her volume. She said the humiliation had already happened when Margaret slapped her in front of hundreds of guests at the wedding. One of the older men cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Another guest, an older woman with a stern mouth, said plainly that hitting a pregnant woman could not be treated like a minor family dispute. The statement didn't carry gossip, it carried disgust. Margaret's eyes flashed, and she tried to hold on to her composure, but the room no longer leaned entirely toward her. Margaret turned on Ethan, blaming him for letting control slip. The phrasing was revealing. It wasn't about love, it was about dominance. Ethan stiffened as if struck by words. He didn't defend Grace. He didn't defend himself. He simply absorbed the blame. A man caught between obedience and reality. Jonathan opened his briefcase and placed documents on the table, presenting them with the neutrality of fact. He explained that multiple assets were legally in Grace's name, according to signed records. Margaret grabbed the papers quickly, scanning the pages with a frantic, darting focus. Her confidence cracked the moment she recognized the language she couldn't deny. Ethan stammered that he hadn't fully understood those details. He said he didn't know the terms. His admission didn't earn sympathy. It exposed negligence. Several guests looked at him differently, less as a respectable groom, more as a weak man who allowed harm through inaction and ignorance. Grace stated that she did not want to destroy anyone. She said she intended to protect her home and her personal safety. Her words were careful but firm, framed not as revenge but as necessity. Jonathan added that if threats continued or violence repeated, Grace could pursue a protective order. Margaret let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, but it sounded forced now. Her certainty was thinning because the room wasn't echoing her anymore. She could feel it. An older guest suggested Margaret apologize to preserve dignity. The advice was offered as a lifeline, but Margaret reacted with fresh rage. She declared Grace had no rights in that house and warned her not to cross the line. Jonathan responded with precision. He said ownership and residency rights were defined by law, not granted by anyone's pride. He didn't argue. He stated, that calm certainty carried more power than shouting. Ethan looked at Grace then, truly looked at her, as if he were seeing for the first time that she was no longer the silent woman who would absorb anything to keep peace. Margaret ended the meeting with bitterness, her final words sharp and ugly. But the room's atmosphere had already turned. The guests were no longer purely her audience. Grace rose and walked out of the living room with measured steps. She didn't slam doors. She didn't announce victory. She simply left, holding her belly with quiet awareness, knowing something important had happened. Margaret had stepped into a trap without realizing it, one built from documents and witnesses, from public standards and undeniable paper. Grace kept walking until the voices behind her faded into a heavy, meaningful silence. The next morning, Grace woke before the house fully settled into daylight. The air that slipped through the estate's tall windows carried the bite of early cold, around 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind that made you feel awake, even when you wanted to hide under blankets. She pulled on her cream overcoat and fastened it carefully, not rushing, not trembling, as if each button was a quiet reminder that she still owned herself. Downstairs, the kitchen was already alive with soft movement. A longtime housekeeper stood near the counter with a dish towel in her hands, eyes flicking toward Grace and then away. The look was worried, tight with sympathy, but trained to stay silent. People who worked in houses like this learned quickly where safety lived, and it was never inside the truth. Grace offered the woman a small, gentle smile. It wasn't the kind of smile meant to reassure herself. It was for someone innocent who could be crushed for speaking one wrong sentence. Grace didn't want anyone else pulled into Margaret's war simply because they had a conscience. Ethan walked in wearing his navy suit as if he had slept in it. His eyes were shadowed, the skin around them dull with exhaustion. He looked like someone who had spent the night absorbing pressure from his mother and waking up to the realization that pressure was now leaking into everything he touched. He didn't greet Grace warmly. He didn't ask how she felt. He stood there, silent and tense, like a man waiting for a verdict. Grace kept her voice level. She said she needed to go out for a short time to see her doctor and finish paperwork related to her pregnancy. She chose those words carefully. Simple, ordinary, difficult to challenge without sounding unreasonable. Ethan's head lifted slightly. "Where are you going?" he asked, and the question didn't carry concern. It carried control, the way Margaret's questions always did. Grace felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the recognition of being monitored rather than cared for. "I have personal business," she replied, brief and calm, nothing more. The firmness in her tone made Ethan's expression flicker. He seemed startled that she hadn't explained herself, that she hadn't apologized for needing space. As she stepped outside, her phone vibrated. Jonathan Reed's name appeared on the screen. Grace answered quietly, keeping her gaze on the driveway as if she were only checking a routine call. Jonathan told her the paperwork to transfer and formalize her control over residency was ready and prepared according to proper procedure. His voice was precise, steady, and he reminded her that everything had to be clean and transparent. No shortcuts, no hidden angles, so no one could accuse her later of setting a trap. Grace's grip tightened around the phone as she listened. She wasn't excited. She wasn't triumphant. She felt something quieter, heavier, relief, mixed with resolve. This wasn't revenge. This was structure. She drove to the notary's office with both hands on the wheel, the cold air still lingering in her coat. Inside the office, the lighting was neutral, the walls plain, the chairs practical. There was no grandeur here, no family legacy, no pearl necklaces, just paper, ink, and laws that didn't care how rich the Millers were. Grace signed the documents with black ink, her handwriting clear and deliberate. Each stroke felt like cutting through invisible rope. Jonathan watched and explained again that the process had to be above reproach. If the Miller family tried to spin a story, her defense would be truth that had been recorded properly, in the right places, at the right times. When the paperwork was stamped and returned to her, Grace held the sealed, official packet in her hands and felt the weight of it like a shield. It was only paper, but it represented boundaries that Margaret couldn't rewrite with a voice and a glare. Grace drove back to the estate without rushing. She didn't take side roads. She didn't hide. She wanted the confrontation in daylight, in the open, where intimidation had less power. The estate rose into view behind its gates, still beautiful, still imposing, still pretending to be a sanctuary. Inside, Margaret sat in the living room, holding a champagne flute, posture composed like she was expecting obedience to walk through the door. But Grace saw it immediately. The smile wasn't as certain as it used to be. Margaret's confidence had a crack now, even if she didn't know why yet. Grace walked in, removed her coat, and set a thick envelope on the coffee table between them. The motion was quiet, controlled, final. She did not throw it down. She placed it there like a fact. Margaret's eyes narrowed. She picked up the envelope and pulled out the papers. Her gaze moved quickly over the first lines, then slowed. Her fingers tightened. A small tremor touched her hand, just enough to show that something she thought was impossible had become real. Ethan stepped closer, peering over the pages. The color drained from his face. He looked as if he had suddenly realized he was no longer protected by ignorance. The documents didn't accuse him. They simply revealed how weak his position truly was. Grace spoke evenly. She said that from today forward she would decide her residence, and that everything had been recorded and confirmed. Her voice wasn't cruel. It was calm, the calm of someone who had finally chosen herself. Margaret exploded, calling her a traitor, accusing her of betrayal. The words were loud, sharp, desperate to reclaim authority. But the room responded differently now. The shouting didn't land the way it used to. Power couldn't erase stamped paperwork. Grace asked for the car keys and a few personal documents. She said she would be staying somewhere safe for the time being. The request wasn't dramatic. It was a practical next step. Ethan lifted his hand as if to block her, the reflex of a man trained to stop whatever his mother didn't like. Then he froze, mid-motion. His arm hung in the air, suspended, because memory hit him like a blow. The wedding aisle, the slap, the way he had stood still while Grace absorbed pain alone. His hand lowered slowly, as if his body finally realized it had no moral authority to restrain her. Margaret's voice turned sharp. issuing an order toward the hall. She called for security to keep Grace from leaving. Footsteps approached, but before they could reach the room, Jonathan Reed entered, composed and immediate, as if he had been waiting for the moment Margaret would overplay her hand. He stated plainly that holding someone against their will could constitute unlawful restraint. His tone was not threatening, it was factual, and the fact carried weight. The security staff hesitated. Their loyalty was paid, but not unlimited. They looked at Margaret, then at Jonathan, and the hesitation became a decision. They stepped back. They were not willing to sacrifice their own futures for a dirty order. Grace turned without hesitation and walked up the staircase, each step steady, each step a beat of freedom. She gathered what she needed: medical records, a few maternity outfits, personal items that belonged to her and no one else. She moved efficiently, not tearing drawers apart, not creating chaos. She was leaving, not fleeing. At the bottom of the stairs, Ethan stood with reddened eyes. His mouth opened, but no apology came out. The words stayed trapped in his throat, heavy with shame and fear. He watched her like someone watching a door close on a life he hadn't protected. In the living room, Margaret sank hard into the chair, the champagne still in her hand, and for the first time her posture looked uncertain. Not defeated by emotion, but unsettled by reality. Grace returned to the living room holding her bag and her folder. She looked directly at Margaret and said, calmly, that violence could not be hidden behind reputation. The sentence was simple, but it struck like a gavel. It didn't invite debate. It ended illusion. Grace walked out of the estate without giving a speech. She didn't announce a war. She didn't demand anyone follow her. She simply left, the silence around her heavier than any argument. The front door closed behind her with a firm, final sound, and in that quiet, Grace understood the truth she had been building toward. A new chapter had begun for her and her baby, and it opened not with noise, but with the clean, unmistakable click of leaving. Grace was staying in a short-term rental apartment with solid security, about 25 miles from the estate. The building was quiet, the kind of place where doors closed softly and no one asked questions. Cameras watched the entrance, and a keyed elevator limited access to residents. The distance gave her breathing room, not just in miles, but in control. At home, she wore a light gray maternity dress, loose and soft, choosing comfort over any need to appear composed. The fabric rested gently over her belly, and she moved carefully, aware of every signal from her body. This space was temporary, but it was calm, and calm mattered now. Jonathan Reed called in the late morning. His voice was steady as he explained that someone had sent him a video of the slap at the wedding. Grace felt her grip tighten on the phone. She asked what the footage showed, and Jonathan described it plainly, without emotion, as if precision itself were a form of protection. The clip was unmistakable. Margaret's face was clearly visible, her movement deliberate. Grace was seen standing upright as the blow landed, absorbing it without falling. There was no blur, no obstruction, no convenient confusion. The moment existed exactly as it had happened. Jonathan asked Grace whether she wanted to use the video strictly as legal evidence or also allow it to be released publicly. Grace paused. She understood how easily pain could be turned into spectacle, how quickly truth could be swallowed by outrage. She did not want noise. She wanted clarity. She chose a controlled path. She told Jonathan she wanted the video preserved as evidence, handled properly, without commentary or theatrics. She wanted the truth to stand on its own, supported by process rather than applause. A copy of the video was submitted to the appropriate authorities through Jonathan's office, following every required step. Grace did not post it. She did not comment on it. She let procedure carry the weight, trusting systems that could not be bullied by reputation. Even without her participation, rumors spread quickly through the local community, especially among traditional families who treated weddings as public declarations of values. Conversations shifted in church hallways and neighborhood cafes. Familiar smiles grew cautious. The story traveled faster than she expected. A local news page published an article about violence at a wedding. Careful in language but clear in implication. Older residents argued openly, some insisting family matters should remain private, others pushing back with the question of safety. The debate sharpened with every hour. Again and again, one point surfaced. Respect for pregnant women was a moral line that could not be crossed or excused. Grace did not read the comments herself. Jonathan summarized what mattered, shielding her from the rest. Margaret began calling repeatedly. Some messages carried a hard edge, warning Grace to stop damaging the family name. Others shifted tone completely, portraying Margaret as wounded, misunderstood, pushed too far. The changes were abrupt, almost rehearsed. Grace did not answer. She understood that any response could be reshaped, quoted out of context, used to regain control. Silence was not surrender. It was a boundary. Ethan sent a message asking to meet. The words were awkward, uncertain, as if he were searching for the right position rather than the right responsibility. Grace replied once, stating that all communication would go through her attorney. She offered no emotion and no invitation. Margaret, meanwhile, told acquaintances that Grace was acting silent as a strategy, suggesting calculation instead of self-protection. It was an old tactic, one meant to blur sympathy and redirect doubt. Grace heard about it and felt the familiar sting, but she stayed quiet. Jonathan prepared a formal legal response, reminding Grace that the matter could not be handled casually or softened by social influence. The record would speak clearly, and clarity was their strongest shield. Grace attended a prenatal appointment that afternoon. The doctor advised her to reduce stress and avoid direct confrontation. The routine of the clinic, the calm instructions, grounded her. She left with paperwork and a renewed sense of priority. Later that day, a handwritten letter arrived from an older guest who had attended the wedding. The writer apologized for staying silent, admitting fear of making a scene. Grace held the letter for a long moment. It hurt, but it also affirmed that someone had seen what was wrong and named it. A local radio station aired a segment discussing abuse within respectable families and how status often hides harm. Grace listened briefly, then turned it off, choosing quiet over saturation. Public reaction shifted from curiosity to anger. Too many people recognized parts of their own stories in what they heard. Margaret began receiving different looks at church and at the women's club where she once held effortless authority. The air around her changed. Ethan faced direct questions at work about the incident. There was no polite way to avoid them. Grace did not take satisfaction in his discomfort. She understood it as consequence, not revenge. Throughout it all, Grace remained publicly silent. She let evidence speak, not tears. Her restraint protected her child and denied her opponents the drama they wanted. That evening, Jonathan informed her that the next step would be an official meeting concerning safety and residency rights. Grace prepared herself, knowing Margaret would perform for reputation. She sat by the window as street lights flickered on, feeling her baby move gently, a quiet reminder of what mattered most. She whispered a promise that they would live where no one had the right to raise a hand again. Near midnight, a final message from Jonathan confirmed that everything was ready for a decisive confrontation. Grace read it once, set the phone down, and the apartment settled into a heavy, waiting silence. The meeting took place in Jonathan Reed's office, not at the estate, deliberately chosen to avoid the weight of Margaret's home territory. The room was neutral, quiet, and professional, with wide windows and a long table that left no room for intimidation. Grace arrived early, grounding herself in the stillness. She wore a navy maternity dress and carried her medical file tucked neatly under her arm. The gesture was intentional. She wanted every part of this meeting to be clear, documented, and real. Nothing would be left to interpretation or performance. Ethan arrived alone, also in a navy suit. His shoulders slumped in a way that made him look smaller than she remembered. His face carried the tiredness of someone who had lost his footing and did not yet know where to stand. He avoided Grace's eyes at first. Jonathan took the seat beside Grace, not across from her. His presence set the tone. This was not a family discussion. It was a legal one. He opened the meeting calmly, outlining the purpose and boundaries before anyone could drift into emotion. Ethan apologized. The words came out softly, carefully chosen, but they were filled with absence. Grace felt the delay in them, the months of silence that had hollowed out any sincerity. She listened, without interruption, her hands resting lightly on the folder. When Ethan finished, Grace asked a single question. She asked whether he loved their child. The room shifted. It was not an accusation, but it demanded an answer that could not be managed or deferred. Ethan looked up, forced to meet her gaze. He said yes. Then, after a pause, he admitted the truth beneath it. He said he had been more afraid of his mother than of losing his own family. The confession landed heavily, not as relief, but as confirmation of what Grace already knew. Grace accepted the honesty without anger. She understood now that this was not a momentary failure, but a pattern rooted in character. It was not something an apology could fix. Jonathan moved the conversation forward, laying out the legal options available: separation, divorce, and the structure of asset division. Ethan asked if there was any chance to repair what had broken. His voice carried desperation, not hope. He spoke of reputation, of his family name unraveling. Grace answered plainly. She said the chance had existed at the moment of the slap, and it had passed then. Ethan lowered his head. There was nothing to argue against a truth that simple. Jonathan presented a protective agreement focused on Grace's pregnancy and her right to privacy throughout the process. The terms were firm, designed to remove leverage and limit interference. Ethan agreed immediately. He did not negotiate. He understood that he no longer held moral ground to bargain from. The pen felt heavy in his hand, but he signed. The door opened unexpectedly in the outer hall. Margaret appeared, champagne flute in hand, her posture confident as if arriving at a celebration. The effect was jarring. Jonathan stood and instructed building staff to maintain distance, making it clear that safety was the priority. Margaret raised her voice, accusing Grace of stealing her son and using paperwork as a weapon to seize family assets. The words were sharp, practiced, meant to provoke. Grace did not flinch. She looked directly at Margaret and spoke once. She said that being a mother never justified a violent hand. The sentence was measured, final, and it cut through the noise without raising her own voice. Margaret laughed bitterly, claiming Grace would not survive without the Miller name behind her. Jonathan responded, reminding Margaret that substantial assets and residency rights were already documented as belonging to Grace under lawful agreements. Margaret shifted tactics, moving into psychological threats. She warned of public shame, of whispers and judgment. Grace did not respond. She knew the community had already seen the video and drawn its conclusions. Ethan stood between them, visibly shaken. This time, he did not retreat into silence. He told his mother that she had gone too far. The statement was overdue, but it carried weight. Margaret turned on him with a look of disbelief, unused to resistance. Grace signed the divorce papers. Her hand trembled slightly, but her eyes did not. The motion was controlled, deliberate. Jonathan confirmed the protective conditions and outlined the next legal steps without ceremony. Margaret was escorted out due to disruptive behavior. The door closed behind her, cutting off the last echo of her voice. The office settled into a heavy, quiet. Ethan lingered, as if waiting for Grace to look back. She did not. Turning back would mean returning to the cage she had just unlocked. She gathered her things, stood, and left the room. In the hallway, she placed one hand on her belly and felt a steady calm spread through her chest. It was not relief. It was certainty. She had just given her child a future untouched by violence, and the silence that followed felt earned. Time passed, and Grace focused on caring for her pregnancy while staying far away from any games of status or reputation. The noise that once defined her days faded into distance, replaced by routines that protected her body and steadied her mind. She learned to measure success by calm mornings rather than public approval. She moved to a quieter neighborhood where neighbors greeted one another by name and security was dependable without being intrusive. The streets were lined with modest trees and soft porch lights, the kind of place where evenings settled gently instead of echoing with expectation. The move was not about hiding. It was about choosing peace. At home, Grace wore light-colored cotton maternity dresses, simple and breathable, choosing comfort over display. Each morning began slowly, with careful steps and steady breathing, listening to what her body needed. The days were ordinary in a way that felt revolutionary. Jonathan Reed kept her informed as legal procedures advanced smoothly. Clear records and consistent witnesses left little room for delay or manipulation. Grace read his updates with quiet acknowledgement, trusting the process without becoming consumed by it. Margaret's influence in the community weakened as word settled into fact. Older residents, many of whom valued tradition deeply, did not accept striking a pregnant woman and denying it afterward. Invitations grew fewer. Conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Some of Margaret's former friends avoided her altogether, not out of loyalty to Grace, but out of fear of being pulled into disgrace. The isolation was subtle but complete, and it followed Margaret wherever she went. Ethan lost several key roles within the family company under public and internal pressure. Meetings ended without him. Decisions were made elsewhere. Grace observed these changes from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a detached understanding that consequences move on their own. She realized that their collapse did not require her attention. Her energy belonged to her child. That truth simplified everything. Grace joined a support group for women who had experienced abuse. The meetings were quiet and respectful, without spectacle or judgment. Stories were shared carefully, received with dignity. In that space, Grace learned that strength often looks like survival practiced day after day. She came to understand that she had never been weak. She had simply been taught to stay silent for too long. Naming that truth loosened a weight she had carried without realizing it. As her due date approached, the weather turned cold, hovering around 38 degrees. The hospital, however, was warm and clean, its halls calm and efficient. Grace arrived, prepared, focused, and unafraid. She entered the delivery room, supported by professionals who spoke gently and moved with purpose. There were no raised voices, no humiliation, no fear. The experience unfolded with respect, exactly as it should have. Her baby was born safely. The first small cry filled the room, and Grace cried too, overwhelmed by relief rather than pain. She held her child close, feeling a sense of completion that required no audience. The baby rested against her warmth, untouched by the past. Whatever suffering had come before no longer defined this beginning. Grace understood that clearly. Jonathan sent congratulations and confirmed that all rights and protections for mother and child were secured under the agreement. Grace thanked him briefly, appreciating his steadiness more than words could express. Ethan asked to see the baby. Jonathan arranged the request through formal channels, ensuring no emotional pressure could be applied. Grace agreed under specific conditions, recognizing the difference between a father's role and the harm that must never be repeated. Margaret attempted to make contact, but restraining orders and oversight blocked every approach. The authority she once wielded could no longer reach into Grace's life. For the first time, Margaret encountered limits she could not bend. The helplessness unsettled her. Power had always been her language, and without it, she drifted in a quiet confinement of her own making. Grace wrote a letter to her child and placed it in a drawer. In it, she explained that dignity is not a gift given by others, but something each person must guard. The words were simple, meant to be read when understanding came. She decorated the nursery in soft, gentle colors, creating a world where no raised hand belonged. Every choice carried intention, every detail an answer to what had been taken before. On quiet nights, Grace rocked her baby and remembered the silence in the wedding aisle. She promised herself that history would not repeat. The promise felt solid, not hopeful. The community gradually moved on, as communities do. The scandal faded from conversation, but the moral lesson remained with those who had witnessed it. Grace did not need acknowledgement. She needed continuity. Margaret lived with regret born from a single act that unraveled the authority she believed permanent. Ethan lived with remorse for choosing comfort over protection when it mattered most. Their reflections no longer reached Grace. Grace did not seek revenge. True justice, she learned, was living without fear. One gentle morning, sunlight filtered across the porch. Grace stepped outside, holding her baby, the air cool and clear. The world felt open, uncomplicated. She looked at her child and understood that the decision she made that day was never about causing fear. It was about making wrongdoing face its cost. Grace smiled, sensing a future no longer shadowed by Margaret's presence. For the first time, the path ahead felt entirely her own. The story closed, with mother and child moving into the light together, leaving behind a past that no longer had the power to touch them.